My name is Renata Hale. I'm 35. There's a sentence my brother Preston has said at nearly every family gathering for the past 2 years, usually somewhere around the second drink, always in roughly the same words. Some engineer almost cost me everything. I have heard that sentence maybe a dozen times. I have nodded along to it a dozen times. I did not know, until a woman named Diane Okafor stood up at my father's retirement party holding a glass of Prosecco and said my full professional title out loud, that the engineer my brother had been quietly resenting for 2 years was me. I want to tell you what happened in the 4 seconds after she said it, because I've replayed those 4 seconds more than almost anything else in my adult life. My father's face did something I had genuinely never seen it do before. Not anger. Recalculation. The specific expression of a man watching two facts that have lived in separate rooms of his mind for 2 years suddenly get shoved into the same room and refuse to stop touching. Preston's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. And I stood there, in a renovated 1910 flour mill my brother had spent 4 years and most of our family's spare capital converting into the venue currently hosting my own father's 67th birthday, and understood, all at once, exactly how long a single filed report can sit quietly in a county records office before it finally, accidentally, finds its way back to the dinner table. Welcome to Velvet Revenge Stories, where the quiet ones get their say eventually, on their own schedule, and the people who underestimated them are rarely braced for it. If you've ever done your job exactly right and gotten blamed for it anyway, by people who never bothered to learn what the job actually was, you already know the shape of what's coming. Drop a comment, tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe, because there's another one of these waiting for you next week. I should probably explain who taught me to read a fire, because nothing that happened at that party makes sense without him. My grandfather, Eugene Hale, spent 31 years with the St. Paul Fire Department, the last 9 of them as chief. Everyone who'd ever worked under him called him chief even decades after he retired, including, occasionally, my own father, which used to make my grandfather laugh in a way that suggested he found it both deserved and slightly absurd. He used to take me on ride-alongs when I was a kid, strapped into the cab of an engine that smelled like diesel and old rubber, and he'd talk to me the entire time about fire the way other grandfathers talk about weather fluently, specifically, with the kind of attention that comes from 40 years of watching one thing closely enough to understand its grammar. He had a phrase he repeated often enough that it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like a fact about the physical world. Smoke always tells you where the fire actually started, even when everybody in the room is pointing somewhere else. He meant it literally mostly. Fire investigators read burn patterns, char depth, smoke staining, the specific signature heat leaves behind, precisely because people are unreliable narrators of their own emergencies. Panicked witnesses point at the wrong door, the wrong outlet, the wrong cause, with complete sincerity, every single time. The smoke doesn't lie. It just requires someone patient enough to read it correctly instead of trusting whoever's shouting the loudest. I didn't understand, until I was much older, that he was also describing every family I would ever sit at a table with. He gave me his old fire helmet shield, the brass one from his last year as chief, the summer I turned 13. He told me to keep it somewhere I'd see it, not because I'd ever need it professionally, but because some objects exist to remind you of a discipline rather than serve a function. I've kept it on a shelf above my desk for over 20 years. I have never once used it for anything except exactly that. He died when I was 26, in his sleep, 83 years old, for years before any of what I'm about to tell you happened. I think about him constantly in this profession, which is its own kind of strange, since he fought fires and I mostly prevent them on paper, in code reviews and inspection reports that almost nobody reads closely except the people whose job it is to argue with them. I'm a fire protection engineer at Cornerstone Fire and Life Safety Engineering in Minneapolis, where I've worked for 9 years, the last 4 as a senior project engineer. My specialty is life safety compliance review for commercial renovation and adaptive reuse projects, buildings being converted from one use to another, which is precisely the kind of project that generates the highest rate of code violations in the industry, because old buildings have old bones, and old bones rarely meet new fire codes without serious, expensive intervention. I review egress capacity, sprinkler coverage, fire-rated assemblies, smoke control systems. I write reports that tell developers things they often very much do not want to hear, at exactly the moment in a project's timeline when hearing it costs the most money to fix. I have written 190 some of these reports across 9 years. I am good at the part of the job that requires precision. I have had to get considerably better over the years at the part of the job that requires delivering bad news to people who've already spent money assuming they wouldn't hear it. My family describes what I do at gatherings as Renata does something with fire codes, which is a sentence that has the strange quality of being completely accurate and almost entirely useless at the same time. My father worked 30 years in commercial banking before he retired. He understands, in a general sense, that I'm an engineer. He has never once, in 9 years, asked what a life safety compliance review actually involves, and I stopped offering the explanation unprompted somewhere around year 3, once I understood the explanation wasn't actually being requested. I need to tell you about the Millhouse project, because none of what happened at that party makes sense without understanding exactly what I did, and exactly how completely I failed to connect it to my own family until it was already sitting in front of 300 guests. In the spring of 2 years and 4 months before that party, Cornerstone was retained by a development entity to conduct a full life safety compliance review on a 1910 flour mill in northeast Minneapolis being converted into an event venue. The retaining entity was listed on our engagement letter as Millhouse Properties LLC. I had never heard that name before, and I want to be honest that I never thought to ask who actually stood behind it, because in 9 years of commercial work, I have reviewed buildings for probably 60 different LLCs whose ownership structure is, frankly, none of my professional business. My job is the building. The building doesn't care who owns it. I spent 6 weeks on that review. What I found was serious enough that I don't think any qualified engineer in my position would have signed off on it as submitted. The egress stair on the building's north side had been narrowed during a previous, unpermitted renovation decades earlier, bringing it below code minimum width for the occupant load the venue was planning to host. The sprinkler system covered the main floor adequately, but had a significant gap in the mezzanine level, where the original architect's drawings showed a storage loft that the new design intended to convert into a second-level event space for up to 90 additional guests. And the fire-rated separation between the mechanical room and the main assembly space had been compromised by ductwork installed sometime in the 1980s, in a way that would have allowed fire to move into the primary occupied space considerably faster than code intended. I wrote all of this up in a 41-page report, dated, signed, and sealed under my professional engineering license, and I submitted it to Millhouse Properties LLC through their project manager, a man I met exactly twice and have not thought about since. The report forced a closure of construction activity for nearly 5 months. While the egress stair was widened, the mezzanine sprinkler gap was closed, and the mechanical room separation was properly rebuilt. I moved on to the next project. That is, genuinely, the entire extent of my involvement. I did not think about Millhouse Properties LLC again for 2 years and 4 months. I had no reason to. I had no idea at the time that the name on that engagement letter belonged to an investment group in which my own brother held a controlling interest, funded substantially by a portion of my grandfather's estate that had passed to my father, who had in turn invested it in Preston's venture with the kind of quiet, hopeful pride fathers sometimes bring to a son's first serious business undertaking. I found all of that out roughly 2 years later, and not from anyone in my family. Here's the part of this I find hardest to say cleanly, so I'm going to say it plainly instead. For 2 years, I sat at family dinners and listened to my brother describe a delay that nearly bankrupted his venture, caused by, in his words, some engineer who clearly didn't understand how these projects actually work. And I never once put it together. Not because I'm careless. Because the report had gone out under our firm's name, addressed to a project manager I never saw again, for an LLC whose ownership structure was simply not something I'd ever had occasion to look up. I want to be honest about something else, too, because I think it matters to the rest of this story. There were moments, across those 2 years, when Preston's frustration with that delay would surface at dinner, and some small, uncomfortable part of me would feel a flicker of professional defensiveness on behalf of whatever engineer he was talking about. Because I knew, generally, that the kind of finding that shuts down a project for 5 months is almost never an engineer being difficult. It's almost always a building that genuinely wasn't safe yet. I never said this out loud. I told myself it wasn't my fight, since I didn't know the project, didn't know the engineer, had no standing in the conversation beyond a vague professional solidarity with a stranger. That stranger was me. I had been quietly defending my own decision, to my own family, without any of us knowing it. My father's retirement party was scheduled for a Saturday evening in September at the Millhouse because Preston had been wanting an excuse to showcase the finished venue to the extended family for over a year. And our father's retirement after 31 years in banking gave him exactly the occasion he'd been waiting for. 300 guests. String lights through the original timber trusses. The mezzanine. The one with the sprinkler gap I'd flagged 2 years earlier, now properly covered, though I didn't yet know that detail connected to anything I'd been involved in, fully built out as a second-level lounge space for the evening. My colleague Tasha Lindvist, who has covered for me on more late nights than I can count, and who knows the broad outline of my family's tendency toward long-simmering resentments, told me directly, the week before the party, that she thought I should consider skipping it. She said, "Renata, you've told me about this delay thing your brother's still sore about." Whatever that actually was, walking into his own venue for your dad's big night doesn't sound like it's going to be the place to find out the details. I told her I'd be fine. I genuinely believed that at the time, because I had no idea the details she was warning me about were ones I already possessed, just filed under the wrong name in my own memory. I set one rule for myself before that night, the same way I generally do before any family event that's likely to involve my brother and a few drinks. I was not going to talk about work under any circumstances, no matter what got said around me, because 2 years of overhearing Preston's grievance about the venue had taught me that there was no version of that conversation where staying quiet wasn't the easier path. I want you to remember that rule. I'm going to come back to it. The party was, by every ordinary measure, a genuinely good night. My father looked happier than I'd seen him in years, moving through 300 people in a building his own son had built, in the specific glow of a man being celebrated by people who love him. I want to be clear that I was glad to be there, glad for him, glad even, in a complicated way, for Preston, who had clearly poured himself into making this night feel exactly like the showcase he'd always wanted it to be. My father introduced me to several of his old banking colleagues over the course of the evening, and each time, his introduction followed almost the exact same shape. "This is my daughter Renata. She does something with fire codes, very technical. I never quite understood the details myself." He said it warmly. He's never once said it unkindly. But after the 4th or 5th repetition, standing in a building I had quietly made considerably safer 2 years before any of these guests ever set foot in it, something in me went a little quiet in a way I didn't examine closely until later. Preston found me near the bar around 9, 2 drinks into the evening, in the expansive, easy mood he gets in when a room full of people is admiring something he built. He put his arm around my shoulder and told one of his college friends, gesturing at the mezzanine above us, that the place had almost died in the crib. Some engineers' report nearly buried the whole project. Cost us 5 months and a 6-figure change order we hadn't budgeted for. He said it the way he's said it a dozen times before, with the specific, well-worn rhythm of a story that's been told often enough to lose its edges. I held my glass and said nothing, because I had set a rule, and because I genuinely still had no idea, in that exact moment, that the story he was telling was mine. Diane Okafor found us a few minutes later. I knew her, vaguely, the way you know people who move in the same small professional orbit you do, without ever quite becoming close colleagues. She's the regional deputy fire marshal for Hennepin County, and our paths had crossed at exactly 2 industry conferences over the years, plus, I would later learn, she'd personally signed off on the Millhouse's reopening inspection after the original remediation was complete. She'd been invited because her husband works with Preston's design-build contractor, a detail I didn't know until much later, and that turned out to matter enormously. She said hello to Preston, complimented the venue, and then turned to me with the specific, pleased recognition of someone placing a name they'd seen somewhere professional. She said, "Wait, Renata Hale, Cornerstone? You're the engineer who wrote the original Millhouse life safety report, aren't you? I pulled that file constantly during the remediation inspection. That mezzanine sprinkler gap you flagged. If that fire 2 summers ago had happened before the retrofit instead of after, we would have had a genuinely different outcome up there. I mean that as seriously as it sounds. I want to walk you through exactly what happened in the 4 seconds after she said that, because I've thought about it more than almost anything else in this entire story. My father's face did something I don't think I'd ever seen it do. Not anger. The specific, visible work of 2 facts that had lived in entirely separate rooms of his understanding for 2 years, suddenly forced into contact with each other. Preston's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. He said, "Wait, what fire 2 summers ago?" Diane looked between the 3 of us slowly, the particular expression of someone realizing, in real time, that she has just detonated something she had no idea was live. She said, carefully, there was an electrical fault in the mezzanine storage area before the 2nd floor build-out opened to guests. Contained quickly, no injuries, but it started directly above where the original sprinkler gap had been. The retrofit is the reason it didn't spread into the main assembly floor. Preston said, slowly, that was never in any report I saw. Diane said, it was in the incident log. It's public record, technically, though I understand most people don't go looking for it unless they have reason to. I'm not going to pretend the rest of that night was easy, because it wasn't. I want to tell you what actually happened, though, because the version where everyone immediately understands everything and the night resolves cleanly isn't true, and I'd rather tell you something true. My father pulled me aside maybe 20 minutes later, near the building's old freight elevator, now restored as a design feature, and asked me directly whether I had known, the entire time, that the engineer Preston had been frustrated with for 2 years was me. I told him the truth, which is that I genuinely had not known, not until about 20 minutes earlier, standing in the exact spot where I was now standing with him. I told him I'd written that report for an LLC name I had no reason to connect to our family, and that I'd moved on to other projects the same way I do after every review, without tracking what eventually became of the building. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked me something that I think mattered to him more than anything else that night. He asked whether I would have written the same report, knowing it was Preston's venture, knowing what the delay would cost him. I told him yes. Immediately and completely. I told him that the report wasn't a judgment about Preston's project. It was a measurement of a building's actual condition against a code written, line by line, by people who'd studied exactly the kind of fire that happened in that mezzanine 2 summers later. I told him I didn't get to choose what the building needed based on whose name was on the LLC. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something I think I'll remember for the rest of my life. He said, your grandfather would have said something almost exactly like that. I held on to that the rest of the night, the way you hold on to something you've been waiting a long time to hear without quite knowing you were waiting for it. Preston found me near the end of the night, considerably more sober than he'd been at 9, in the specific quiet that comes over a person once a party has mostly emptied out and there's nothing left to perform for. He asked me directly whether I'd known, this whole time, that it was me. I told him the same thing I'd told our father. He absorbed that for a while, looking up at the mezzanine, at the string lights, at the building he'd spent 4 years, and a meaningful piece of our grandfather's legacy building. He said, I've told that story a dozen times. Some engineer. I never once thought about who actually wrote it, or why, or whether they were right. I told him I understood. I told him that in my experience, almost nobody thinks about the engineer until the building proves the engineer was right, and by then it's usually because something's already gone wrong. He said, the fire. 2 summers ago. I didn't know about that. I said I didn't either until 20 minutes ago. He was quiet again. Then he said, almost to himself, smoke always tells you where the fire actually started, even when everybody in the room is pointing somewhere else. Grandpa used to say that to you constantly. I always thought it was just a thing he said to make you feel important on the ride-alongs. I told him it wasn't just that. I told him it was the most honestly useful sentence anyone in our family has ever handed down, and that I'd spent 9 years building a career around taking it literally, and apparently, without realizing it, around taking it personally with this exact family more than once. He didn't have much to say to that. But he didn't argue with it either, which from Preston, that night, felt like something real. I want to be honest about how this resolved, because it hasn't resolved into something simple, and I don't think it should. My father has asked me, twice since that night, actual specific questions about my work, what egress capacity means, how sprinkler coverage gets calculated, why a storage mezzanine matters as much as a ballroom floor. I don't think he fully understands the engineering yet. I think he's trying, in the specific, late-arriving way some parents try once they finally understand there was something worth asking about all along. Preston has not fully reckoned, as far as I can tell, with the gap between the story he told for 2 years and the story that turned out to be true. He apologized, briefly and somewhat awkwardly, the week after the party, and I believe the apology was genuine as far as it went. I don't think he's spent much time yet with the larger version of it, that the delay he resented cost him 5 months and a 6-figure change order, and that the same 5 months and the same change order are very plausibly the reason no one was seriously hurt in a building full of people 2 summers later. I haven't pushed him toward that larger reckoning. Some realizations have to arrive at their own pace, the same way smoke takes its own time to clear enough for someone to finally see where the fire actually started. Like they always say, the people who spend years blaming some unnamed bureaucrat for an inconvenient truth rarely expect that bureaucrat to be sitting at their own dinner table the entire time, quietly defending a decision they didn't even know was theirs to defend. My grandfather spent 31 years teaching people to read smoke instead of trusting whoever in the room was shouting the loudest about where the fire started. He handed that habit down to exactly one person in this family, on a series of ride-alongs that smelled like diesel and old rubber, and he had no way of knowing it would eventually need to be turned, gently and almost by accident, on his own grandson's resentment of a report his own granddaughter had written. I think about him often in this work. I think about him especially now, standing in a building that's safer because of a report I wrote for a name I didn't recognize, about a family member I didn't know I was protecting. Using exactly the patience he spent a childhood teaching me to bring to buildings that, like people, rarely tell you the truth in the order you'd prefer to hear it. My name is Renata Hale. I'm 35. I'm a senior fire protection engineer. One fire, 2 summers later, that never made it past a mezzanine because of 5 months nobody in my family understood they should have been grateful for. And one fire marshal with a glass of Prosecco, who said my name out loud at exactly the moment it mattered most. If this reminded you that doing your job exactly right is sometimes its own quiet defense, even when nobody around you understands what you actually did, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment. Tell me what hit you hardest. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.